My name is Emily Manns, and I'm the executive director here at Preservation New Jersey. And we're really excited. We took kind of a month off from our Q&A with PNJ series, but we are back. We have an incredible speaker today in Donovan Rypkema. And I'm excited that our education committee member, Adrian Trevisan, is actually going to have a conversation with him, with all of you today. Before we start, I just want to say a little bit about Adrian, and I really appreciate him kind of coordinating today's event for you. He is a member of PNJ's Education Committee. He is a graduate of UPenn's Historic Preservation Program, and he's also an architectural historian. Today, our format might be a little bit different for people that have been on our Q&A with PNJs before. This series, it seeks to allow for some networking opportunities as well as education. But today, because we did have close to 50 people signed up, we want to get right into the content. But there will be the opportunity to introduce yourself and ask questions in the last 15 minutes of the program. So the way we'll run is the first half hour, Adrian and Donovan will have a interactive conversation addressing topics that are relevant to all of us in the preservation world. One of the exciting things about this particular talk is it's part of our new Summer of 10 Most series, where we're trying to add more value and education opportunities for 10 Most sites, past and present. So I'm excited that you're here for the first in this series. And without too much further ado, I'm going to turn the reins over to Adrian and Donovan. I'm going to spotlight their videos for everyone, and enjoy the session and hold those questions because there will be interactive Q&A about from 7:30 to 7:45. So welcome everyone, and thanks again.
Great, thank you, Emily. Well, hello everybody. As Emily said, I'm on the education committee, and we were sitting talking about what kind of things could we programs could we develop for the coming year for Q&A with PNJ. And we were talking about the 10 most list and how, probably one of the things you want to do when you get on the 10 most list is figure out how to get off the 10 most list and how not to be an endangered property. And so one of the things that came to my mind immediately was Donovan. Despite my exterior appearance, I'm a recent grad of Penn's program. And Donovan gets on the train every Friday morning at, 5 a.m. or whatever in Washington, D.C. and comes up to teach a class. And it's a great class because it's very practical and all focused on the economics of historic preservation. So I thought he would be great to give us some ideas about kind of, as I said, how to get off the 10 most list. But before we get into that, maybe Donovan, you can give us a little introduction about yourself. Who are you? Where did you come from? How did you get here?
Did you mean that in a metaphysical sense, or can
yeah, sure. So why not?
Well, I have a consulting firm called PlaceEconomics and a companion firm that does work outside the U.S. called Heritage Strategies International. And we do a variety of things, but both of them are at the intersection of historic preservation and economics. So I came to that. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C., and I've lived here for 35 years, but came from South Dakota, where I was in the real estate appraisal and business and small development. And out of sheer capitalist greed, when the first tax credits came around in the late 70s, I did a project. I didn't know anything about stupid old buildings, but I thought, oh, I can save some taxes this way, and got involved in historic preservation and met people who called themselves preservationists. I'd never encountered them before, all of whom talked about real estate, none of whom knew anything about real estate. And so that just kind of evolved into an opportunity to kind of create a little niche for myself. Oftentimes, I just think of myself as the translator between the world of real estate and economic development and the world of historic preservation. So,
thank you. Well, so maybe you can give us an idea of the kind of projects that you do at PlaceEconomics, and then give us a sense of kind of the methodology that you use in some of those.
Sure. Well, we at PlaceEconomics, we really have three areas that we work in. We do a lot of studies on the impacts of preservation And those will include both city and state level studies that will look at a number of metrics about how the historic preservation activities affect the local economy. We also do those kind of impact studies of state Main Street programs and of state tax credit programs. So that's the kind of impact analysis stuff. Second area is policy. And so again, all of our clients, we're a private sector firm and we're a small firm. There's 5 of us and we live in 5 different cities. But all of our clients are either not-for-profit organizations or government entities, public entities. And particularly in recent years, we've done a lot more policy work, mostly for cities. And that is cities saying, we want to have more historic preservation, but we don't have the tools. So what ought to be the tools that we can use and apply to mostly encourage private sector investment in historic preservation. So that kind of impact analysis, policy recommendations. And then the third, we just kind of broadly lump into kind of capacity building or education. And so that's workshops, training, speeches, sitting with you doing an interview in New Jersey. So those are the kind of areas we work in. Internationally, it's largely the same, although there tends to be, simply because of in part data limitations and in part kind of what clients are looking for. We do much more policy stuff internationally than we do the kind of impact analysis, and a lot of kind of capacity building internationally as well. So that's what we do in a normal year. And of course, for the last 15 months has been anything but normal. In a normal year, I spend 220 or 30 nights a year in hotel rooms. So this has been the longest stretch without my boarding an airplane for at least 40 years. And then Adrian, you asked about methodologies.
That was my next question.
Yeah. So our kind of general approach kind of depends on what the subject matter is, but a general approach is to, especially when we're doing city level studies, and the city level studies we've learned are really the most effective because they most directly impact those who can make decisions. We usually look at local historic districts and see what is true there that is different from the city as a whole. And we always cast a wide net. And every time we do one of these, we find more stuff to look at. So in the last 4 or 5 years, we've done city level studies in large places in New York City twice, and in Los Angeles, in San Antonio, in Miami-Dade County, mid-sized cities like Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, Raleigh, and then some smaller places, Saratoga Springs, New York, and Cumberland, Maryland. We're in the midst of a study right now in Phoenix. So what we do is we look at the differences, and we started out looking primarily at the differences in the change in property value over time. That's kind of the baseline, and we still do all that. But that's grown. We've now looked in 35 or 40 cities about the different patterns of foreclosure rates during the real estate crash in the early, from 2009 until 2011 or 12. Where there's a consistent pattern of lower rates of foreclosure in local historic districts, usually in the range of 1/3 to 1/2 of the rate in the city as a whole. So it's a huge statistical difference. But we also look at things like you can, since you had to sit through my class, Adrian, you had to learn this stuff. I don't apologize to you, but apologize to everybody else. They have to sit in this stuff. But there's a concept in economics called revealed preference. And that is, I can ask you, do you like chocolate ice cream better or vanilla ice cream better? And you'll say, I like chocolate better. Well, that's stated preference. But the other way I could do it is to hold 2 ice cream cones and say, here, Adrian, pick the one you want, and you pick the chocolate one. Well, that's your revealed preference. So you don't have to say it, you revealed by your action. Well, that's kind of an approach we use methodologically. And we look at things like, where do small businesses choose to go? Where do startup businesses choose to locate? where is there a pattern of minority owned and women owned businesses? And is there a difference? And is that difference positive in historic districts? Knowledge workers, creative class workers. Every time we just look at a wider net, we look at things like proximity to transportation, to parks, to schools, to institutions in historic districts. We look at issues of density in historic districts. Often historic preservationists are saying, hey, we got to have density if we're going to be efficient in government and to save the environment, and you guys are ruining the density equation. Well, it's the other way around. In fact, every place we've looked at, the most dense neighborhoods in the city are usually historic neighborhoods. So, we use a variety, but our kind of base approach in this impact analysis is what's true in historic districts and what's different that's happening there than is happening in the rest of the city.
So it sounds like a lot of this is quantitative. Where do you dredge up all this data?
It is quantitative, and really, 15 years ago, we couldn't have done it. And the three things have changed in that time to allow us to do this analysis. One is GIS, the fact that you can pull up on geographical basis numerical data. I don't even know what the hell GIS stands for, but I'm smart enough to hire smart young people who do, and so they do that work. So we use the second thing that's changed is simply the availability of big data. So there's just tons of stuff we can look at. And then really the third thing, I should say there's four things. The third thing is, like I said, smart young people who can kind of do this, data looking. And then finally, smart clients. I wish I could say that I was smart enough to say, oh, this is why we do all this stuff. No, it's really clients who said, we need to look at this, or we want an understanding of that, and give us the opportunity to kind of answer questions for them.
And that was actually a question that came to mind as you were talking. I mean, so when a city sits down, they give you a phone call and they say, we need you to come help us. Is it, are they saying, should we bother having an historic district, or should we expand it, or should we shut? I mean, what do they want to do with the data that you give them?
Yeah, it really varies on the client. It really varies on the client. Sometimes they do it simply saying, we think we have a great story about historic preservation to tell, and we just like kind of evidence basis for that. Mm-hmm. And so they hire us to do that analysis just to kind of tell their success story. Sometimes it's to build political support where that's wavering. That they think that a kind of more evidenced approach thing will convince the city council member, the mayor, the whomever. Sometimes it is for the evidence to advance a particular policy. One of our favorite clients, because we've done a whole bunch of different things for them, is San Antonio, that maybe have the best citywide preservation office in the country. They're just really forward-looking great. Well, a couple of times in the last year, there's a major, like there is in most American cities, there is a affordable housing issue in San Antonio. Right. So they wanted to say, and the city taking big initiatives on affordable housing, but the preservation office said, we think we have something to contribute. So we were hired, I called it our old stuff study. We were hired just to look at the role that older housing, whether or not it was in a local historic district, the role that older housing plays in meeting just in the marketplace affordable housing needs in San Antonio. And that really was in part so they could make sure they were at the table in the affordable housing discussions, and also kind of make the policy case that we can't be tearing down stuff if we want to have affordable housing. Those are mutually exclusive. Demolition and affordable housing are opposite things. And if you want one, you can't be doing the other. And they just kind of wanted evidence of that. The second thing that we did for San Antonio, again, was a policy issue, is they were proposing a demolition ordinance that, preservationists want to save all the properties they can save, but sometimes that can't happen for a variety of reasons. So they just didn't want to be taking stuff to the dump. And so they had proposed to the city council to pass a demolition ordinance or a deconstruction ordinance The council said, yeah, we don't know enough about this. So go back and learn something and come back. And so they hired us to say, what would in San Antonio a deconstruction ordinance mean? So the kind of motivations of clients, and about, especially on the city level, about half of them have been city governments, the other half, the local preservation advocacy organization. And their motivations different, but they kind of fall in those areas.
And I remember one homework that I think I did reasonably well on, where we were looking at I think Bethesda or something, and there was a big debate about whether or not to set up an historic district or not, and if it was going to be economically advantageous or not to the residents. Do you have that kind of, I mean, is that a typical kind of project that you do, or?
It is, but we have, and maybe it's just my stubbornness, but we have a kind of in-house rule that if we do an analysis about impacts, that study does not include recommendations. And the reason that we draw that line is that it's just too easy. If you say, oh, here's what we found and here's what our recommendations are, it's just too easy for a critic to say, well, you just pick what to look at so you can support the recommendation you already. So now sometimes we do make recommendations, but we try to divide those out. So in the last couple of years in both Miami-Dade County and in Nashville, they wanted impact analysis. They also wanted recommendations, but we then really did two separate reports to look at that. Now, we don't we don't do like surveys, and we don't try to, make the case for this particular neighborhood being made a local historic district. We try to provide the evidence that, so local advocates and the client can kind of make that case. The other thing, however, and you are absolutely right, that we're mostly a quantitative research firm, but one of the things that we have learned, just not because I'm smart, we just learned it by doing this, is that the numerical side is necessary but not sufficient. That it really has to be accompanied by the human side, by the sidebar story, by the qualitative information. So we always include in these, we'll have a bunch of numbers, charts, and graphs, but we'll also have the story about the people, and it might be somebody who's been a longtime resident in the neighborhood. It might be some young woman who started a business in an historic district, whatever, but to kind of tell the human side of that story. And for some people, I don't care about your stupid numbers. I want to know how it's affecting human beings. And so that's why we learn to do that.
Right. Well, I know you're a big fan of historic tourism too. What? That's sarcasm. Donovan hates
it. Is,
tourism.
yeah.
And maybe you can, but I know that's, when you say
it is
the economic impact of historic preservation, often that's the first thing that pops to people's minds. And maybe you could explain to folks why.
Sure.
Why you have the opinion of it that you think.
Yeah, well, it's not that I think heritage tourism has the potential of being real positive economic impact. And I'll talk in a second about why that's true. My goal in life, however, and I'm getting old, so I better reach the goal pretty soon, is when somebody who says economics and historic preservation in the same sentence, that the default response is not, oh, you must mean heritage tourism. Because yes, it can have a huge impact, but it's just not remotely the only one. We don't even look at it unless a client specifically requests we want to look at tourism. Now, having said that, when we do look at it, and it's a consistent pattern, is that heritage visitors stay longer, visit more places, spend more money per day than tourists who come to your town and aren't heritage-based tourists. So if you're going to have so that the impact of heritage visitors is significantly more than tourists in general. And so it can be, as long as it's kind of property managed, it can be a good tool. Now, we don't there's plenty of tourism analysis firms around, so we don't claim to be one of those. But I sat on a panel some years ago with a guy who's spent his life in heritage tourism. And he said a sentence that stuck in my mind ever since. And that is, if you do it for the locals, the tourists will come. If you do it for the tourists, only the tourists will come. So it seems to me the underlying strategy ought to be, what can we do with our resources for the local people? And if we do that right, we'll have this kind of bonus of heritage tourism.
Got it. Makes sense. So I guess you probably know I'm under with a lot of support from Emily and Preservation New Jersey. New Jersey's enacted this historic tax credit, and I gather they're still, writing the regs to go along with the legislation. But what effect have you seen? I expect you look at a lot of tax credit stuff. What effect have you seen for that, and what can you make any kind of provision forecasts for us?
Happy to.
Yeah.
So we have, because we do a lot of this analysis of the impact of state tax credits. And and this is a real numbers geeky thing, but prior to California and New Jersey recently enacting state tax credits, there were 17 states that had never had a state tax credit. And really representative. I mean, there were big states like population big, like California, like New Jersey, like Florida. And there were states all over like South Dakota and Alaska. And so there's a good range. So that 17 states was a good representation of the whole. So what we have done over 30 years worth of data, looked at the patterns of expenditures using the federal tax credit of those never had state tax credit states versus tax credit states. And the general pattern is that when the state adopts an effective state tax credit, the use of the federal tax credit goes up 20 to 40%.
Which
in New Jersey, it's going to go up 3 times. I'll tell you, this is assuming that the rules are right yet. This is going to be a huge, huge boon in New Jersey. The average over the last 30 years of tax credit use, federal tax credit use in New Jersey has been about 43 million a year. In the last few years, about 53 million. That's going to go to 120 million. And it's going to, as soon as it's happening. And the reason is, I said that this makes a difference when there's an effective tax credit program. Well, effective means that either there is no cap, or the cap is high enough so that there can be plenty of activity. Well, you're going to have a $50 million annual cap in New Jersey. That's enough, at least for start. That's enough to generate a lot of activity. And to contrast yourself with Pennsylvania, for example, Pennsylvania has a state tax credit, but there's an annual limit of $3 million. Well, so what's happened, and we did a study of their state tax credit a few years ago. What happens is, if I'm a developer, I'll say, yeah, if we get the tax credit, yeah, it's a kind of little frosting for us, but we can't build into our assumption we're going to get it. It's just too small. The likelihood of our getting is so statistically remote. We simply can't go to the bank and borrow money, assuming that we can get this tax credit. That's not going to be the case in New Jersey. So you're going to say, I'll tell you, 5 years from now, the last 5 years average is going to be 120 to 130 million dollars a year in New Jersey. The other good news about that is, I think in New Jersey in particular, there's going to be a couple of beneficiaries to that 60% or so of the town municipalities in New Jersey are less than 10,000 population. Well, there's a small population, and that, while there's some exceptions, that often means relatively low rents. Well, if the rents are real low, you can't do a rehabilitation. You can't recover the money. But if you can combine, you layer the federal and the state tax credit so that the tax credit picks up a lot of the cost, then you can still survive on having those $8, $12, $16 rents. So I think there's going to be a big benefit in small towns in New Jersey. And the other end of the spectrum is the larger cities that have suffered, decades of disinvestment until the last, in some cases like Newark and to a lesser extent Camden, seen investment in the last few years. That's also going to be a boon in those places for kind of a different set of motivations. But I think this is fabulous piece of legislation, and assuming that the regs are written as they ought to be, it's going to be a huge, and you don't have to care about stupid gargoyles. I'm telling you, what's going to mean is people having jobs, good, well-paid jobs in the state of New Jersey.
Well, and I guess too, it strikes me that they're almost 2 phases to that benefit. And the one is the immediate one, that is, you're saying developers come in and they're, rehabbing this building or that building. But then is the stuff that you've looked at, have you looked at places kind of the next, right? Okay, so now we have a restaurant row of all these rehab benefit buildings, what's the benefit from the tax credit because of that? Have you done that kind of long-term work?
Exactly right. So you're such a smart guy, Adrian. You should have taken my class. You'd be really smart. So a few years ago in Louisiana, and they have a state tax credit, but with state budget problems, it was kind of always in jeopardy. And so the lieutenant governor in Louisiana, unlike in most states, he or she has a constitutional responsibility. So they have real tasks. And among them is, under the lieutenant governor is a number of departments, including the State Historic Preservation Office. And the lieutenant governor, there was a big fan of the state tax credit. But here's what he told us. He said, I've gone to the legislature on both sides of the aisle. And he said, I tell them about all the jobs. And Louisiana had a couple of studies on the kind of job creation of that. And he said, and I tell the legislature, look, all these jobs. And they say, yeah. We want to know two different things. We want to know, sure, that building gets a tax credit, good things happen to that building, but what about the stuff around it? What is this kind of ripple effect? And second, we want to know the human side of that story. Who are the people who are benefiting from these? And so our tax was a different kind of tax credit analysis. It was really on this kind of external impact of the state tax credit programs and the people that were involved. My favorite example was in New Orleans, but not one of the great neighborhoods in New Orleans, the Garden District or French Quarter that everybody knows about. This was in a neighborhood where it kind of wasn't much happening. And it was a 1950s two-story automobile dealership that had sat empty for I don't know how many years. And surrounding it was nothing but vacant land. And this owner of this dealer used a state tax credit, rehabilitated it, turned it into a grocery store. From Katrina until that event, there was literally no building permits in that area, none, zero, zip. He did that project, $100 million worth of other development all around it, but most of it new construction because it was mostly vacant lots. But we talked to the developers of all those projects. Every one of them said the reason we had the confidence to do it was because that a grocery store was redeveloped in that historic building.
Well, I see we're getting close to the half hour, so I want to ask you one last question, which is, we started this by saying this is part of the 10 most list, and how do I get off the 10 most list? So I wonder if you have any advice on fairly easy steps for places to take.
Well, I have a couple. Yeah. First of all, whoever, and I really like your list, by the way, because it's so kind of as diverse as the state of New Jersey is. And while half of them are individual buildings, the other half are something greater than that, neighborhood or a whole town or whatever. And I think that's great to approach it that way. I think for those building owners who have one of those most endangered, it really represents a funding opportunity. Because what it says is somebody besides the building owner cares about this building. That's important to more people than just me, the guy who owns it. And so I think it really represents an opportunity to raise funds, to focus, grant monies, investment monies, whatever, on the most endangered and nationally, both on the national and state levels. These most endangered lists have had a huge impact over the long haul in saving buildings. They really are an effective tool. If I were the czar of some town in New Jersey, good or bad, you can argue about good politics or bad politics, but this gazillion dollars that's coming through this American Recovery Act, 65 billion with a B, is going to go to towns and cities. Another, I don't know, 50 million or so going to state, or 50 billion going to states, and with largely not many strings attached. This is a once in 3 generations infusion of capital. And the stupid thing for a mayor, city council, or borough council to do is spend it on short-term things like, well, let's hire 5 more cops. Well, maybe you need 5 more cops, but don't piddle away this money on 5 more cops for a year. You need to look at it for long-term capital investment. And what better thing is to say, let's take a chunk of this money and find that project in our community. And again, particularly in these municipalities where you put on the most endangered, here's a great opportunity, not just to create a historic district, but to provide some tools, maybe some incentives for investment to take place in those places, using this as a kind of one-time pot of money to leverage other resources. I think it's a huge opportunity. And preservation advocates are saying, hey, whenever we're getting in the town of X in New Jersey, we ought to make sure that the council sets aside amount of a share of that to address historic preservation issues. And I think particularly in those places that have a spot on your most endangered, that could make a gargantuan difference.
Great, thank you. Well, that's good to hear. We're gone 2 minutes over. Hopefully Emily won't make that penalize me for that.
No.
And we have a question in here. I'll just I mean, how do you want to do this, Emily? Should I read them, or do you want people to ask live, or how do you?
Yeah, sure. I think the one that Keith posted, feel free to read it. And then, yeah, folks, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. So maybe write in the chat that you'd like to ask a question, and then we'll call on you. So.
Okay. So Donovan, we have one from Keith Dewey, who says, just curious about what international analysis and policy work you've done and where. And what lessons translate to the US, especially in educating and showing economic impact to the general committee?
Kurt, thanks for the question, a great one. Well, I'll give you two recent ones. We just finished the first phase of a two-phase project in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where this really was interesting. I wouldn't have thought of doing it, but the city government said, we have 4 commercial districts in Calgary that are primarily heritage district, primarily made up of heritage buildings. We want to know the value of those, but not just the economic value. We want to know the triple bottom line value of those districts. So in the economic value, but also the social value and the environmental value of those heritage districts. So our firm was responsible for the economic value, obviously, but also the social value. And we looked at a willingness to pay survey, a kind of thing that's been done a lot in the environmental world, done a little in the historic preservation world, but not so much in North America. So it was a kind of the first time for us. So we applied it there. And here was the kind of interesting thing. The economic value, the base economic value of the heritage buildings in these 4 districts was about $400 million. But there was a heritage premium of about an additional 40 million that the marketplace rewarded them because they were heritage buildings. That they, what they should have sold for was X, what in fact they were worth was X plus, and that premium isolated to their quality and character of their heritage. There was another couple $100 million of non-heritage buildings that are located in the heritage districts, and beyond their base economic value, there was another 55 million that those buildings achieved in value because of their proximity to heritage buildings. So the first of them we call the heritage premium, the extra on heritage buildings. The second we call the heritage halo effect, this enhanced value of properties nearby. And then there was about 80 million in social value and 26 or 27 million in environmental value. So out of this whole package, it worth about total values of about $900 million, 273 million of that was not from the base economic values. It was from these other kinds of triple bottom line values to those districts. The other one I'll mention is in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, where we just last year about this time finished a study for them. They have what they call their modern heritage initiative, that the UAE, Abu Dhabi, the Emirate of Abu Dhabi is an ancient civilization, but it was always nomadic. There was really never, rarely actually buildings until they discovered oil in the mid-50s. And then they very rapidly urbanized. And so the preservation, the heritage conservation people say we don't want to be caught in having kind of national amnesia about important categories of buildings that really reflect the evolutionary development of our cities. And so our assignment there was not so much impact, although there's some of that, it was mostly what are the tools to put together, the incentives, the strategies, the policies to encourage private sector investment in those heritage buildings.
Got it. And Emily asks if you can explain what a willingness to pay survey is. Is that kind of like the ice cream when a
Well, kind of, yeah, kind of it is. And it's, again, it began as the environmental world, and a lot of it out of the World Bank, the World Bank is a bank. But being a bank, they have to know what the asset they're lending on, but there's some kinds of assets that aren't traded in the marketplace. We know that the Amazon rainforest has to have a value, but there's no rainforest that are sold in the marketplace. So there has to be some other mechanism to assign a value to that. And it's called contingent valuation analysis. It's looking at activities, and there's kind of 2 or 3 tools. One of those is a willingness to pay survey. And so basically you ask the question, what would you be willing, in the case of Calgary, we worded very specifically, so nobody think that it was an excuse for the city to raise their taxes. What would you be willing to make as a donation, a one-time donation, voluntary donation, to maintain the character and the quality of these 4 neighborhoods? And so they've said, now 35% of the people, not surprisingly, said nothing. I'm not giving something for those districts, but 65 said something, and it averaged out that on a per household basis, every person in city of Calgary was willing to give $60 to maintain the character and quality of those heritage neighborhoods. So we really use that as a proxy for the social value, because people saying, I'll just pay because those neighborhoods are important to me as a citizen of Calgary.
So how big was your sample size for something like that?
Well, it wasn't too big. It was 300 or 400, but we adjusted for size and demographics.
Right.
The city had a huge database of social media contacts and used that to reach citizens. And so the only place there was some skew there was a kind of as you would expect from a social media based list. There was a kind of skew with a greater share of millennials and a lower skew of 65 and under. So we adjusted for that, but at least large enough. So we were plus or minus 7% in the end on the answers. So large enough so we could be relatively reliable.
Cool. Okay, we have a question. Have you done any analysis of the historic district in Salem City, New Jersey?
No, we have not. Sorry,
Okay.
We'd love to. So
sure, and I guess if whoever asked that question wants to explain a little bit more, maybe you can, or anything similar. I don't know. And you're mentioning social media just reminds me that if anybody wants to see more of Donovan Rypkema after tonight, he has an extensive collection on YouTube, which
not so extensive, but yeah.
Well, so I had, I guess, and I'm not sure if you talked about, you kind of glazed over. One of those YouTube videos was you and Ed Glazer going kind of toe to toe about historic preservation leading to housing shortages.
Yeah.
And I guess wondered, it sounded like, if I remember that, you pushed back pretty well there.
Well, the issue, and Ed Glazer, both a nice guy and really brilliant guy, and he's about 70% brilliant and 30% his head in a dark place. He's just mischaracterized preservation. And he always starts out every presentation with saying, my father was an architectural historian and I love historic buildings, but, and then it's the but where the nonsense comes in. But it's our fault as preservationists. We haven't sufficiently made the case so people like Ed Glazer understand that preservation has moved beyond only being about saving the mansions of rich dead white guys. That's not what preservation was 50 years ago. That's not what preservation is today. But Glazer and his allies would say, oh yeah, we need to preserve these great buildings, but to preserve a whole neighborhood of kind of modest housing, what is that about? That's just killing us. Well, it's because there's more to our municipal histories than just the mansions of rich dead white guys, and preservation are way ahead. So if you would default to the Glazer position, we'd be back to a very elitist, racist, narrow definition of what preservation is, frankly. But the other issue on the housing thing, where is just wrong, is he says, well, these historic districts, they're preventing, you can't build big high rises there, and we're going to grow population in New York City. Ergo, we can't expand. We're stuck, and so if we can't grow out, we have to grow up. And historic districts are keeping us from doing that. Well, yeah, you can't, most historic district build a 90-story building, but less than 5% of the land in the city of New York is under the purview of the Landmarks Commission. Now, I come from the real estate development business. I'm not anti-real estate at all, but if you're not smart enough how to figure out how to use the other 95% of the land to add density to New York, maybe you're not smart enough to be in the real estate business. The other thing is that the historic districts are among the densest in the city. Of the low density neighborhoods in the city of New York, 1.1% of low density neighborhoods are in historic districts. 99% of low density are not historic districts. So if you have to add density, add it, for God's sake. Don't be picking on the historic districts that are already among the densest there are.
Got it. Another question. I'll read you the whole question because it starts with a statement. I love, in capitals, the social, environmental, and economic value approach used in Calgary, Alberta, and in Dubai. Also interested in learning more about the funds available to municipalities via the American Recovery Act. We need to get New Jersey municipalities understanding the varied benefits of historic preservation. So I guess, do you know enough about ARA to be able to talk about that?
Not entirely. I mean, I think it's another case where the regs are still being written, kind of like the New Jersey tax credit stuff. It's coming in 2 waves, one this year and one next year. There's some limitations, but they seem not great. I think it's going to be the most flexible of federal funds that cities will have, and every little place. And 60% of your towns in New Jersey are under 10,000 people. Right. Every little place is going to get some little chunk of money. Might be $200,000 in some place of 2,000 people, but it's a great opportunity. So I have no expertise, and I think the final regs are still being written. But I know that smart mayors around the country have really been pushing to say, Biden administration, let us be as flexible as possible. And I think they're listening to that. And some of it's going to be kind of directed to neighborhoods in need, but almost by definition. Downtowns and older neighborhoods will fall under the neighborhoods in need categories. And so I think you're going to find ways to, smart city councils and city attorneys are going to find ways to make good use of it.
Cool. All right, so here's another question from Susan Tully. I'm in a town where the county determined our downtown should be an historic district, but the town hasn't designated it as such. Many of the properties are individually listed on our historic sites inventory, although much of the historic architecture that remains is on the 2nd and 3rd floors above remodeled storefronts. Would there be an economic value to the owners of these buildings, to the town? Oh, I see. Would there be an economic value to the owners of these buildings if the town designated this as a district, given the new law? Thanks.
Absolutely. A huge opportunity. And again, Adrian mentioned a bit ago about saying, all right, well, what's the kind of spin-off effect of this? Nothing can help a downtown more than upper floor housing. Nothing. And it's this great opportunity to create great space in those upper floors of those buildings, many of which are going to be sitting vacant at the moment. And to have it I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of individual designation. I don't think we should throw it out as a tool, but most of the benefit comes from the group of buildings. And it comes from that old real estate cliche, is the three most important things are location, location, location. Well, that fundamentally is why there's this benefit of the district, is that everybody benefits from the context within which their individual buildings. So I do think it should be a local district. The advantage of that is it provides some protection over time. So one idiot can't screw up the whole strategy. So yes, the protection is good, but it also, if it's whatever the criteria are to use the state tax credit, that also needs to be included, because this is a chance. I mean, if you think about using the new state tax credit, the federal tax credit, you can pay 60% of the damn bills doing the work with tax credits. And as I'm reading I know the regs aren't out, because I'm reading the preliminary stuff on the New Jersey law, the tax credit's going to be transferable. And so even if you, as the building owner, don't need it all, you can turn that into cash by finding somebody who does. So this is, I'm telling you, this combined set of factors ought to do a wonderful thing. By the way, almost 2/3 of your small towns in New Jersey have lost population in the last decade. This would be a great strategy to kind of reverse that in quality downtown upper floor housing.
So we're over time, but there's one more question I want to ask you, and then we'll wrap this up. So question is, have you ever had success changing the mind of a specific developer who was planning to demolish an historic building to preserve it instead? If so, what was the incentive?
Yeah, I first of all, and this is not false modesty, we never claim credit for anything, because it's always our clients who do something with it. So we have the other thing, we have a kind of a principle that we'll talk to the agnostics, we won't talk to the atheists. And so if somebody's already determined I'm tearing it down, we just haven't, we don't spend the time for that. But most, not all, but most people who own buildings and most developers are in the end interested in their own economic advantage. And so it is a situation where you have to structure it's not that they hate old buildings. It's just saying, hey, if I do X, I can make Y. And so if you can figure out a way, okay, you can still do X and make Y, but doing with this existing building. So sometimes it's simply the demonstration of the alternative. Oftentimes, and by the way, that brings up another rule, is that never, ever, 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 ever do a historic preservation project without using an architect or and a general contractor who have done them before. Never. And what happens, lots of times this developer has his favorite architect and she has told him, oh, no, that just isn't feasible. And so he says, okay, well, we'll tear it down and build something new, where in fact, an alternative, a plan might be equally rewarding. So it really means getting into the weeds of the numbers on the deal.
And that actually brings to mind one last thing. I remember some of the assignments you gave were on books that you kind of workbook kind of things that you guys had developed at PlaceEconomics for people to, in towns and municipalities to use. Maybe you could give a little spiel on what those are and what they might be, and then
well, one of them is that we wrote a thing called the feasibility assessment manual for historic buildings, and it was really written to be used by people who really don't know how to do feasibility studies. It was really just to be done by a group of people who went and answered questions. And so the whole manual is structured: answer this question, answer the next question, do this. And lo and behold, after you've answered all the questions, you've written a feasibility study. And it is a way, really, without spending $1 gazillion for some real estate analyst to do it, to kind of walk through and at least on an order of magnitude basis, get an understanding of what that deal would look like or how big the problem is. If you say, well, this guy can do it and it's cost him $1 million, but he's going to be done and has a property that's only worth $800,000. Well, the difference is called the gap. And so it's important to say, okay, there's a gap, but then how can we fill it? Can we use the state tax credit, the federal tax credit, American recovery money, local grants, CDBG funds, low interest loans, whatever, to close the gap so it becomes a rational economic alternative?
I remember too, you have, just thinking about what people could do, you have case studies published as well, right? So that someone could say, here's an example of, I think I remember reading the Saratoga Springs one, right? That
Yeah.
there was something that was done and the result was positive there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, could we get some money so we can try and get a study and see what would happen? In our
I
town,
don't,
right?
I don't mean this to be self-promoting. It's really not. That
No,
one of
I
our
don't
goal-
either.
no, no,
I'm just thinking of
but,
tools that people could
well,
use. Yeah.
what I was going to say, Adrian, is that we have great clients, and almost every time we have a client, they give us permission to post the study after it's done. So we have now on the PlaceEconomics website, under the resources tab, I don't know, 30 or 40 of these kind of research pieces we've done. Lots of times you kind of duplicate, you don't need us, kind of duplicate the analysis. And so feel free to go on there, download them, and figure out how it could apply to, your town in New Jersey.
Well, I think we're over time. So thank you again, Donovan. We really appreciate coming and talk to us. Emily, back to you.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, I was taking notes. My paper's like covered. That was so much information. And from what I can see in the chat, everyone else also really got a lot out of this presentation. So thank you, Donovan, for your time. Thank you, Adrian, for coordinating this all and staying in such great touch with your professor that we could make this happen for PNJ. I am going to share my screen just one last time here, folks. I'm so glad everyone could come and participate in this. We do have another upcoming event that I wanted to share with you. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, great. On June 22nd, our second in this series of Q&A with PNJ, Summer of 10 Most, where we'll be speaking with Maria Boyce, who's actually a member of our marketing committee, and she's also the chair of the Westfield Historic Preservation, and she has a background in public relations. So she'll be kind of telling us as historic site advocates, giving us an introduction to public relations so we can be even better communicators for our sites. Please, I also wanted to thank the Summer of 10 Most series sponsors. We had sponsors for the first time this year for our 10 Most Endangered announcement. And we also thank them for supporting this special summer of programming. Next, just please feel free to stay in touch with us. Some of you, I see a lot of familiar faces on this Zoom, but you probably noticed PNJ, we're really doing a lot of activity. We've been doing a lot of virtual activity and look forward to some in-person opportunities with you as well. And stay in touch so you can find us. You have our website, our email address, and our phone number right there, so that you can continue to stay engaged and involved with our organization. So thank you again for everyone for coming, and thanks for your time. All right.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.